04, 42 hours. December 2nd, 1984. Severomorsk Naval Command, Northern Fleet Headquarters. Captain First Rank. Viktor Barinov stared at the main console. The line was dead, 1 minute earlier. 7 undersea communication cables spanning from the Barents Sea to the Kara Shelf had pulsed in perfect sync, transmitting encrypted positional pings from deployed Delta-class submarines. Then, without distortion, without degradation, without any warning, the signal flatlined, all at once, all across the network. The line didn't crackle, it didn't degrade, it didn't distort, it simply vanished. At first, Barinov assumed a routing delay. Backup systems were queried. The auxiliary relay blinked green. The automated report read no error detected, but still nothing. He tapped the signal repeat sequence. No response. He flipped to Channel D, designated for strategic submarines operating under radio silence override. No handshake. Then Channel F. No echo. The operator beside him checked the diagnostics and whispered, "System says cables are live." Baranov's face didn't move, but he felt it the one signal every naval officer fears: perfect silence when there should be none. Over the next 3 minutes, comms technicians tried every override. No line responded, no data moved, not a single encrypted burst, not even a fragment of authentication code. It wasn't just one line, it was every line, from every vector, all at once. At 0447, the duty officer initiated Protocol Cobalt Escalation Level 1 by 0449 naval stations from Polyarny, Gadjievo, and Zapadnaya Litsa confirmed identical readings, cable signal lost, link silent, time sync exact. There was no warhead in flight, no explosion, no seismic event. Yet the entire Soviet strategic undersea network had vanished from their grasp. And somewhere in the polar depths, nuclear-armed submarines were no longer speaking. Not because they had defected, not because they had been sunk, but because something somewhere had made the lines go silent, simultaneously. Captain Barinov didn't speak again for 5 minutes. He simply watched the blank console blink, as if it might suddenly remember how to talk. 3 months earlier, Admiral Gennady Chernovin had spoken with absolute confidence at a classified Ministry of Defense conference in Moscow. "The NATO navies may have satellites," he declared, "but we have cables that cannot be touched." The room nodded. Undersea communication was their secret edge, immune to interception, immune to jamming, hidden beneath kilometers of Arctic Ocean, a fortress of silence that spoke only to them. In every Soviet naval doctrine manual, the assumption was clear: cables do not fail, and if they do, it's physical. In other words, sabotage. Not malfunction, not mystery. Redundancy was the pride of the system. Each cable line double-sheathed, pressure-resistant, electromagnetically shielded. Each signal triple encrypted, time-stamped, verified. At Polyarny Naval Technical School, cadets were taught cables talk. If they're quiet, it's because someone cut their throat. In Severomorsk's underground command post, every system engineer, every operations officer, every staff analyst had believed in that logic. Faith in the grid was unshakable. Reports of minor delays were usually dismissed with phrases like seabed current distortion, normal in winter, data spike from sonar relay, nothing abnormal. No way all lines go dark unless war starts. And so, when the impossible happened, when all 7 primary links fell silent, in perfect unison, it wasn't the silence that shocked them. It was that they had no explanation. Credential drop Nav 1 Rear Admiral Sergei Zubov, Chief of Undersea Communications, had once said in a 1982 systems briefing, "The cables are more secure than radio. If they fail, we assume we're already dead. That assumption now hovered over Severomorsk like a ghost. And as the first emergency reports came in, the doctrine didn't flex. It hardened. Senior command declared technical glitch unlikely. Network sabotage under investigation. Enemy action not ruled out. But even that was comforting. Because if it were sabotage, it was explainable. It meant the enemy had acted. It meant there was still a pattern to war. But silence. Silence meant something worse. That the system hadn't just failed to warn them. It had failed to understand what had happened at all. In Soviet naval strategy, undersea communication cables were not backup, they were the backbone, developed throughout the 1970s as a response to U.S. satellite surveillance and long-range radio interception. The system of seabed cables linking the Northern Fleet's submarine bastions to Central Command offered what Moscow believed was the single most secure means of wartime coordination. Unlike radio, cables could not be triangulated. Unlike satellites, they did not expose transmission times or routes. They were invisible, embedded in the seafloor, guarded by geography and distance. Soviet doctrine relied on three assumptions. First, that cables could not be disabled without physical damage, which would be evident through signal loss and electromagnetic decay. Second, that submarines were always in contact, even in silence, using automated status pings and sync bursts through the line every 90 seconds. Third, that disruption would only happen after first contact. In other words, war had already begun. Because of that, the cables were considered a first line of strategic confirmation, a signal not just of command, but of calm. As long as they were transmitting, everything was under control. Their integration into command logic was total. Submarine orders, launch instructions, recall protocols, movement clearance were encrypted and layered into the cable pulses themselves. Code-level updates could be transmitted mid-patrol. Tactical shifts could be issued without breaking radio silence. Unlike air forces or land armies, the Soviet submarine fleet was expected to act within a logic loop, constantly synchronized with headquarters through that undersea lifeline. If a captain failed to receive cable syncs for more than 20 minutes, he was instructed to switch to fallback frequency sweeps. If those also failed, the protocol dictated escalation toward autonomous readiness. In short, if cables died, escalation began. Credential drop number 2 Soviet Naval Strategy Manual. 1981 edition. The cable network is not a luxury, it is the nervous system of deterrence. So when every link fell silent on December 2nd, 1984, the Soviet command found itself in doctrinal free fall. There was no plan for unexplained silence. There were steps for sabotage. There were plans for enemy attack, but not this perfect, unexplained absence. The doctrine had not imagined this moment, and now the doctrine had nothing to say. 0442. Signal drop confirmed. 0443. Backup relay pinged. No response. 0444. Eastern flank repeater toggled. Still silence. 0445. Third officer initiated submarine handshake. Nothing. 0446. Sonar buoys activated for fallback acoustic. Dead channel. 0447. Polyarny confirms cable blackout. 0448. Fleet command requests surface ship status. No anomalies. 0449. Air assets. Check passive detection. No signs of enemy movement. 0450. Silence holds. Too clean. Too total. Inside the Severomorsk command center, every display still showed green. The lights weren't blinking red. The alarms didn't wail. But that's what made it worse. Everything said normal, but nothing responded. The undersea cables weren't cut. They weren't jammed. They were simply absent. Petty Officer Sokolov, manning the signal integrity board, tapped the interface again and again, Signal integrity 100%, line activity 0%, not distorted, not garbled, just void. Credential drop, number 3 logbook notation by Tech Supervisor Volodine. All systems report functional. All cables report 0 activity. First time I've ever seen both. By 0453 Surface Command attempted a force ping to the Novomoskov submarine. It triggered an auto-response from the failsafe array, but the response was empty. The data packet was there. The content was not. Baranov's voice finally cut through the silence. What if this isn't physical? No one answered. Then, at 0456, the Karapelyov relay, buried under 400 meters of ice shelf, sent a malformed checksum. The packet came through, but it didn't decrypt. It was as if the cable spoke, but the voice was wrong. The silence had changed. And in Soviet command logic, silence wasn't just dangerous, it was now unnatural. At 0503, the situation report reached Naval Command Headquarters in Moscow. Within minutes, the official assessment was issued: temporary system disruption. Technical malfunction likely. The message was clear: no escalation, no panic. But inside Severomorsk, that explanation unraveled instantly. Engineers triple-checked every onboard diagnostic. No hardware fault, no software lockup. Every segment of the system confirmed active status, just no data. This wasn't failure. It was functional silence. Still, Moscow insisted. One colonel from Signals Division proposed solar interference. Another pointed to undersea seismic activity. But both theories collapsed under scrutiny. There had been no recent flares, no seismic tremors, and most damming cables across 3 oceanic sectors went silent simultaneously, spanning distances a single event couldn't reach. Baranov requested direct authorization to initiate Protocol Novi Granite, an alert readiness state that would reposition submarines under presumed comms blackout. The request was denied. Moscow's reasoning: positioning without confirmation may trigger NATO response, cables likely experiencing feedback saturation. Recall request will be issued if anomaly persists. They blamed anything but infiltration, anything but compromise. Credential drop, number 4, Internal Ministry, transcript, declassified in 1993. At no time was enemy interference considered plausible. The system had never failed before. That was sufficient. Denial ran deeper than policy. It was psychological. The Soviet military hierarchy was built on the premise of system supremacy. If the cables had failed without attack, then the entire command logic was flawed. So they refused the premise. They needed it to be error, glitch, temporary fault. Not something intelligent, not something deliberate. Over the next half hour, lower-tier officers sent a flurry of internal reports, each more alarmed than the last. Field units begged for fallback instructions. Submarine crews switched to contingency radio but kept silence protocols, fearing that any active ping could expose position. And Moscow kept saying the same phrase: await restoration. No deviation from standard. But the cables stayed dead, and the room began to fill not with noise but with fear that someone else was listening. By 0529, with the cables still silent and no hostile action detected, the first official explanation solidified space weather. A technical bulletin circulated to all command posts cited possible electromagnetic interference from upper atmospheric phenomena. More specifically, a minor geomagnetic storm that had been recorded 2 days prior. The theory, rapid fluctuations in ionospheric charge had somehow induced polarity inversion along submerged lines, corrupting data streams without damaging hardware. It was elegant, scientific, reassuring, and wrong. The analysis relied on telemetry from Murmansk Observatory, which had detected mild disturbances in geomagnetic alignment but nothing strong enough to affect shielded cable networks 300 meters below the Arctic Ocean. The Soviet undersea lines had been tested against 10x those levels during trials. When questioned, Naval Space Operations admitted the storm wouldn't reach the depth thresholds for disruption, but the theory remained in circulation anyway. It was comfortable. Credential drop, Niagara 5 Naval Meteorological Memo. December 2nd, around 1984, electromagnetic perturbation remains most plausible cause. Intermittent silencing is expected to resolve without intervention. That same evening, Pravda ran a classified briefing summary for internal circulation, marked normal operations expected to resume. No hostile indicators. But field commanders knew better. This wasn't intermittent. This wasn't distortion. It was the absence of everything, no burst packets, no header signatures, no code handshakes. Like the system wasn't just silent, it had been wiped clean and overwritten with nothing. Still, the command structure clung to the first theory, because the alternative was unacceptable, if weather wasn't the culprit. Then someone had reached into the most secure communication system the Soviet Union had ever built and turned it off without leaving a trace. By 0612, the first explanation began to crumble. Solar interference, once treated as doctrine, failed to predict or reproduce the anomaly. Engineers, under increasing pressure, shifted to a new hypothesis, algorithmic desynchronization. The theory held that an internal update recently deployed across the Argon depth encryption layer had introduced a flaw in how signal timestamps were authenticated. If every submarine's data burst was arriving out of sync, the central system might reject all transmissions as invalid, discarding real signals in real time. It sounded plausible. The timing matched a software patch deployed 48 hours earlier. Technical divisions issued a statement, Argon Depth Layer 4 undergoing review. Possible handshake misalignment detected. Subsystems may be discarding valid data. This was what the ministry needed: a software culprit. It deflected blame, implied a fix, and preserved the illusion of control. But again, it was wrong. Because submarines weren't just failing to be heard, they were receiving nothing at all. This wasn't a one-way failure. It was bilateral silence. Command systems were active. Submarines were transmitting. No one, on either side, saw a thing. Credential drop, November 6, encrypted log entry from K387 Patrol Unit Standard Sync Attempt X-14. No return ping, no spectrum activity. Silence abnormal. Back in Moscow, naval leadership latched onto the patch theory. Orders were given to roll back the software update and initiate local hard reboots of all signal processing nodes. But there was a problem. Those updates couldn't be rolled back remotely. The entire network required physical access to each repeater. And that took time. Time the Soviet command no longer believed they had. 2 false explanations in one morning, both elegant, both reassuring, both wrong. And while Soviet officers debated solar storms and software bugs, an American reconnaissance sub sat off the coast of Norway, listening to nothing, because the silence itself was the weapon. By 0658, the KGB's Department 8 and the GRU's Naval Reconnaissance Division launched a full-spectrum intelligence response. Every channel human, signal. Satellite was tasked with one goal: determine what had silenced the cables. They found nothing. Electromagnetic scans showed no abnormal emissions in the Barents or Norwegian seas. Surveillance satellites recorded no enemy vessel activity near cable junction zones. Underwater acoustic sensors, normally flooded with oceanic noise, reported reduced background clutter, almost as if someone had muffled the sea itself. Field agents in Norway and Iceland reported no unusual NATO deployments. ELINT arrays picked up normal civilian traffic, and SIGINT teams monitoring U.S. naval command frequencies detected standard low-urgency chatter. Everything looked calm, too calm. Inside the GRU's Lubyanka analysis cell, frustration turned to paranoia. If this wasn't weather, and it wasn't a software bug, and it wasn't sabotage in the traditional sense, what was it? Was this a test? A silent probe by an enemy weapon not yet understood. Credential drop, 7 GRU situation report. Top secret. Deck 3, 1984, operational silence across all channels. No matching NATO activity. Anomaly persists without known cause. No resolution pathway. Compartmentalization made matters worse. The cable project, while critical, was segmented across so many bureaus that no one office had full visibility. The signal encryption protocols were managed by the Ministry of Radio Technology. Physical repeaters were under the Ministry of Shipbuilding. Software layers were split between 4 subcontractors, none with full access to test environments, and in the Soviet system, admitting a systemic blind spot was worse than admitting enemy penetration. So they buried it. Officially, no enemy was detected, no breach confirmed, no failure reported. Unofficially, command grew quiet. Even internal memos were stripped of speculation. Silence had now moved from the ocean to Moscow itself. Because when the most secure system in the Soviet arsenal goes dead without cause, without trace, without warning, you don't investigate. You brace for impact. While the Soviet Union scrambled for answers, the United States had already moved past brute force. The silence on Soviet cables wasn't accidental. It wasn't a glitch. It was engineered. The U.S. Navy, in collaboration with the NSA and DARPA, had quietly deployed one of the most sophisticated electronic warfare campaigns in Cold War history, Operation Ivy Echo, a black program designed not to cut cables, but to erase their meaning. One adaptive signal. Nulling Soviet cables relied on fixed-frequency pulse codes. Authenticated with layered encryption, U.S. systems used ultra-low-frequency interceptors to read timing patterns, then transmitted counterphase nulling waves from unmanned submersibles, canceling the signal in the medium itself. Not jamming, not interception, just subtraction. Soviet expectation interference would look like distortion. American reality. There was no trace, just engineered void. Combat example. During the blackout, a Delta Fu submarine's sink burst was neutralized mid-transit. The boat's AI registered successful send. Severomorsk received nothing. 2. Undersea stealth repeaters, U.S. Deep-sea drones deployed relay devices onto Soviet cable trunks, masquerading as amplification nodes. These ghost repeaters replicated Soviet signal patterns, then injected nonsense bursts to maintain the illusion of functionality during diagnostics. Soviet expectation hardware failure would trigger alarms. American reality hardware responded. It just said nothing useful. 3. Dual domain verification, Soviet doctrine, relied on cables as a singular truth source. U.S. command integrated acoustic, satellite, and electromagnetic layers. Each U.S. sub verified multiple silent channels before taking action, ensuring no spoof could break the loop. Combat example. While Soviet cables fell silent, U.S. Ohio-class subs maintained full comms using the low-rate laser blue-green pulses modulated through ocean thermoclines undetectable by Soviet sonar. 4. Decoy protocol. Masking NSA cryptographers developed decoy pings, signal fragments designed to appear as failed transmissions. Soviet analysts mistook them for internal errors, not realizing they were planted disruptions. Soviet expectation errors were random. American reality. Every error was selected. 5 network resilience layers. Soviet systems were hierarchical top-down. American systems were elastic, multi-node. U.S. undersea networks automatically rerouted data across cable, radio, and even bouncing laser relays from UAVs. If one link failed, 3 others compensated. Soviet expectation 1 link fails, system pauses. American reality 1 link fails, system accelerates. Credential drop number 8, declassified NSA assessment. 1996 Soviet undersea systems were advanced. But they trusted silence too much. We made silence lethal. The United States didn't need to sink Soviet submarines. They just needed to isolate them long enough for Moscow to panic. Not 10% better, 300% smarter, not louder, quieter, not cut, erased. 0642. 7th request to reestablish cable sync fails. 0645, Severomorsk Command initiates fallback protocol for ballistic subs. 0647. Confirmation code ping to K211 fails. 0649, Northern Fleet issues. Broadcast silence order, no active pings, no beacon pulses. 0653, emergency channel open. Static. 0656, K447 reports via acoustic backup, no cable contact. Holding depth. 0658, Ministry of Defense requests readiness status from Strategic Rocket Forces. 0701, submarine group status unknown. 0704, command calculates worst case U.S. attack on cable grid. 0707, full alert draft issued to General Staff. Across 4 time zones. War rooms braced for escalation, not because missiles had flown, but because the Soviet command couldn't confirm that they hadn't. In the confusion, one terrifying question rose from the lower command levels. What if one submarine, cut off, assumes war has started? Under protocol, subs unable to reach Moscow and interpreting simultaneous cable failure as a decapitation strike were authorized to escalate to combat standby. It wasn't just silence now. It was strategic isolation. Severomorsk's primary cable board still flashed green. No physical damage, no loss indicators, just blank packets. The silence had become the system. Credential drop number 9, General Kolesnikov. Private diary. Des 1984. We did not lose cables. We lost certainty. That is more dangerous. At 0715, a faint return ping reached the Severomorsk hub. It was from K-384, a Delta class, on deep patrol. The packet was garbled but structured. A single phrase survived decryption. No hostiles. Holding pattern. Comms dead. They had not launched, but they could have, and it would have been because of a signal that never came. Reversal, quotes. They called undersea cables untouchable. They stopped when they touched nothing. They mocked radio as primitive. They stopped when the ocean fell silent. They trusted encryption. They stopped when silence couldn't be decrypted. The Soviet system hadn't been attacked with missiles. It had been hollowed by information warfare, not loud, not violent, just removed. By December 4th, the cables were operational again. No patch was applied, no culprit found. The system restarted itself. Moscow declared the anomaly resolved. But inside the General Staff, a different mood took hold. They understood now. It wasn't a glitch. It was a message. The incident forced Soviet command to confront 4 foundational errors in their military-industrial philosophy, errors they could no longer unsee. 1. Silence isn't security. For decades, the Soviets believed silence meant stealth, that quiet links, quiet radios, quiet oceans equaled control, but they now saw the flaw silence could be faked, engineered, weaponized. Soviet, quote, silence was not absence of threat. It was its delivery system. 2. Centralization kills. The cable grid relied on singular channels, top-down. Unidirectional trust, one break, and the entire logic tree collapsed. America's redundancy allowed multiple paths. Soviet logic assumed compliance. American logic assumed failure. Soviet, quote, "We built the system as a tower. It fell like one." 3. Visibility isn't comprehension. The Soviets saw green lights, active relays, stable voltages, but none of it meant data. The illusion of normality concealed total blindness. American systems verified with noise measured disruption, not stability. Soviet, quote, "We watched every light and still saw nothing." 4. Control isn't intelligence. The Soviet military prized dominance, predictable, rigid sequences. The U.S. prized adaptability systems that learned, flexed, rerouted. The USSR demanded order. The U.S. weaponized chaos. In the end, the rigid mind failed first. Soviet, quote, "The cables were perfect." That was the problem. Credential drop, Nagker 10. 1985 Internal Naval White Paper. Classified future threats will not cut our lines. They will silence them while we watch the silence blink. The Soviet Union had poured billions into steel, signal, and doctrine. But none of it prepared them for a world where the enemy didn't announce themselves. The new war had no heat signature, no flash, no boom, just disappearance. Of data, of signals, of trust. 0351 December 5, 1984, Severomorsk Naval Hub. A technician reset the main relay console. The light blinked green. Cable status active. Packet traffic normal. No errors, no warnings. The system had come back, but not the confidence. Captain Barinov sat beside the console he had stared at for 30 hours. No announcement was made, no explanation given. But everyone in the room now understood the system could no longer be trusted to scream when it needed to. It could go silent, not with violence, not with sabotage, but with precision. What had once been the most secure network in the Soviet military had been used against itself, not cut, not jammed, just emptied. A ghost grid blinking lies. It was not just a cable disruption. It was a proof of concept that the Americans no longer needed to outgun the Soviets. They could outcode them. That war could start not with explosions, but with absence. It was not just silence, it was strategic blindness, operational isolation. A paralyzing question with no answer, and it only had to work once. The final quote etched into Barinov's report read, "We believed the cables were our ears, but they became our echo chamber. Cold War wasn't won with nukes, it was won with silence. Software and arithmetic Moscow couldn't match.